go live. And it's going live, we're pretty sure. Hey, everybody. If you can see and hear us, why don't you give us a thumbs up in the chat? That's what I want. Sometimes starting this whole streaming thing is kind of weird. You don't know if it's working or not. So let us know. Oh boy. Cullen,
It's
how you
super
doing, man?
weird. Dude, I'm good. I feel
Yeah?
like I feel like we're like doing I feel like my bad student in high school like walking into the back of the classroom several minutes late vibe is
Oh,
infecting your channel because of me. So sorry to keep you waiting, buddy. And all of you
were
guys.
were
Casey's very punctual. Cullen is a little shaggy this morning.
were you that kid in high school? Were you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little tougher in grade school to like sneak into the room incognito when you're the one in the front of the room.
Oh.
So the
Hmm.
move doesn't. I was much better at it in high school. I'll put it that way.
Yes. Yeah, I imagine. Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Well, everybody say hello to Cullen. Welcome him to the stream. Man, I'm so excited to have you on here. And me and Cullen, I think, have become pretty good friends over the last couple of years. Just gotten to hang out quite a bit and talk nerdery. And you're definitely one of my favorite YouTube people, and so thankful for all of the help and guidance you give me on color and just doing life together, man. So it's
Oh,
it's an
thanks,
honor to have
buddy.
you here.
Yeah, it's been you're. We've gotten to strike up a really cool friendship with ResolveCon in the last few years, but even before that, just sharing passion for digging deep and nailing details and the difference that can make to telling good stories.
Oh man. Yeah, so much fun. Gosh, I love talking about things and acting like they matter even though it's like not really that important, in the grand scheme of things. It's like, dude, this isn't like, loving and taking care of my family, but I definitely want this image to look nice. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
and these
Like,
images are definitely my children.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, yeah, for anybody who doesn't really know you, Colin, will you give us a little intro to who you are, what you do?
I'd be glad to. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Cullen Kelly. I'm a colorist, I'm an image scientist, I'm an educator. Really, what I've discovered over the years, over the course of my career, is that if it involves motion imaging, if it involves something in between light hitting a sensor and light hitting someone's eyes, I'm pretty much interested in it and I want to know more about it and I want to, like help to guide that journey for its optimal effect. So that's led me down all kinds of strange avenues in my career, but like my day to day is working as a client facing colorist, doing commercials, films, etc. And then, through my YouTube channel and through my other lanes of my business, I've really gotten to round out what it means to support really, really world class motion imaging and support filmmakers and help people to guide the image on that journey from sensor to screen.
Man. Yeah. Well, that definitely is apparent with your attention to detail and all the gosh, like the nerdiest possible things I think I've talked with you about, and I'll jump into grade school and just kind of lurk most weeks, and yeah, it's always just like one level deeper than probably most people want to get, you know,
Yep.
and it's like half a level deeper than I sometimes want to get, and I'm like, this is still fascinating, but I'm like, yeah, I definitely want to know the response curve of an Ari Alexa and like all this stuff. But I'm like, I never even used an Ari Alexa, man. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't really
Yeah.
care that much, but
I'm more of an idle curiosity.
yeah, yeah. It's like, oh, it's a
Yeah.
chart. I do like charts. I do like
Charts are
those
cool.
graphs.
Well, dude, it's funny because there's always someone who's that person to you wherever you are. It's something that I've learned.
Hmm.
So like I've over the years slowly gathered knowledge, and there's that great saying that an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less.
Yeah.
That's totally happened to me. But like there are like my mentors and people who I look up to, who I'm that guy trying to hang on to the back of the ride as they like whip me around in 20 different directions. They're like, well, here's the thing, and I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa, okay. And I'm barely hanging on, but it's fun to try.
Yeah. And then you realize, wow, I don't know anything. Like
No.
this person has forgot more than I've learned my entire life.
Yep.
That's
100%.
that's just fun. Ugh. It's such a deep world, all this stuff. Isn't it crazy how deep like absolutely everything with video production can go, right? Like you
Yes,
think of just like one specific little part. It's like lighting. Yeah, I mean, you put a light on somebody, but like you can study that for years and years and years and still learn things. Like just with like literally with one light, how to use it. It's just insane. That's what
absolutely.
I think is so interesting about all this stuff is it's just a deep well wherever you go.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. So, tell me, like, what got you so curious about all this stuff? Because I feel like you're constantly asking questions. You're constantly digging deeper in, again, it's like you've said quite a few times, it's like to play guitar, you don't really need to know how a electric guitar works. Um, to do color, you don't need to go as crazy as you do. So, like, what piques that curiosity?
You know, it's funny you should ask. I've been thinking about this recently, and I still don't know the answer to that question, but I have a best guess, a new best guess. My new best guess is a person named Brian May. Some of you guys may know Brian May. Brian May is the guitar player for Queen.
Sure.
Brian May has the best, he is my favorite guitar player of all time for sure. He also has, so like the way he actually plays the instrument, but he also has the best guitar tone of any guitar player I've ever heard.
Hmm.
I love the way the sounds that he makes sound. And the reason for that, he would tell you anyway, is because he pretty much built every inch of what produces his sound. So he's in
Crazy.
there like retooling guitars and amplifiers and pedals and like really owning everything. So he, like, I think that's where my build the guitar, play the guitar analogy might have stemmed from, is looking at a guy like Brian
Interesting.
May. But I
Yeah.
think that's it because I remember, the first time someone kind of hipped me to that at whatever, like 15 or 16 when I was first discovering Queen. It's like, whoa, this guy built that sound? That's amazing. And I think
Dude.
color and shaping that and owning that process with a little bit more kind of granular authority, to use a weird phrase, like
Granular authority.
granular authority. It's actually, let's just make it one word. That'll be
Grand
let's
authority.
let's make that a talk at ResolveCon, granular authority.
Oh boy.
Um, but like I think that's where that impulse to be like, whoa, wouldn't it be cool if I could own my craft the way that guy owns his craft? And I
Yeah,
got a ways
man.
to go, but man, I'm having fun working on it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really cool way to look at it, man, cuz like when you know every inch of something, it's like you can make those informed decisions. So it's like
Yeah.
yes, for like working knowledge, no, you don't need to know all that stuff, but the more that you do know, the more you're like, actually doing this like this one way will make this like 0.5% better. And you
Yeah.
do that 20 times, and that's whatever math is, 10% or something better, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, and
pretty
it's I
cool.
mean like it's funny because we talked about this on my channel recently that like we were trying to answer the question of like do colorists need to know color science? Because that's a lot of what you're
Hmm,
asking about is like why have you bothered to learn so much color science when you don't need to? Like you can
sure.
be a colorist without knowing any of this stuff. And the way I sort of like reframed it in that conversation was like, well, it's the short answer, do you need to know all this stuff to be a good colorist? No, you don't. But the maybe more interesting question is what benefit when you do? Like,
Mm,
does it make an impact on your practice when you do know those things? And to that, I think the answer is an emphatic hell yeah. Like, it
yeah.
makes a huge difference. It's
Yeah.
been the defining difference in my craft of just owning that stuff and really being able to manipulate images kind of on their terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I find it's interesting that, jumping into all these details and stuff cuz like I get curious about this stuff too, and I'll, guys, I'll pepper Cullen with questions at, 2 in the morning. I'll like wake up and be like, "What do you like, is it okay to do this?" And he'll for some reason be up and be like, "Yeah, man, that's cool."
That's
I'll be
cool.
like, "Why are you up?" And he's like, "Why are you up?" Like, "I don't know." Just thinking
Yeah,
about color. Same.
we're we're either working or dadding. There's not
Yeah.
that much sleep in there.
It's just like I'm holding a baby. Holding a baby thinking about transfer functions. Uh,
Yes, living the dream.
yeah. Um, but I found that it's interesting because the deeper that I get with this stuff, the more I find it actually simplifies some things because I can
Hmm.
make some decisions and not worry about all the crazy, like, because if you don't really know what you're doing, there's always this second guessing of like, okay, well, should I use this setting or this setting, or should I do this before or after or anything like that? And the more that you know about color science and the way like the algorithms work and all that stuff in image pipelines and everything, the more you can make those informed decisions and just be like, I don't need to worry about that at all. Like
Absolutely.
I can just do these couple things, and I'll let everybody else fiddle with that, and I'll just keep it simple.
For
And that's
sure.
been a huge thing in my life, and been very thankful for a lot of that stuff, especially when it comes to color management and color workflow and everything. Because I know the last couple of years, I've definitely learned a lot and also simplified a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've really connected over that in a lot of our chats of like, I feel that that's one of the main sort of rewards of going deep on something is that when you're done doing that exploration, you can come back with a simple top level conclusion. But
Yeah.
like, well, it's not that it could be one of these thousand answers, it's that that is the right answer and the others are not as right, you
Yep.
know? So it
Yeah.
becomes simpler than the next time you encounter whatever that challenge is of like, what's the right way to color manage for, as you used in your example, like whatever it is, the next time you come back, you're like, well, I know the right answer. It's
Yeah.
not, and I don't have to look at this field of endless possibility because I know which of those is, I already know which is optimal.
Yeah. I spent a week going full Hardy Boys on this, and I don't need to think about it anymore.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, man.
Exactly.
No, that's awesome. Well, let's kind of get into it. I hear that you have a couple little wisdom nuggets to share with us here. But actually, before we get into that, I want to talk about ResolveCon because if anybody watching, if you don't know, this handsome man right here, is going to be live with us in person in Portland, Oregon, in just a little over a month. We're doing a little event called ResolveCon, and we're inviting the best and the brightest YouTube teachers of the craft of working with Resolve to come and share and hang out and work with people and do contests and all kinds of stuff, giveaways and presentations and workshops and everything. And it's going to be amazing, man. We did this last year. You want to say a little bit about how last year went there, Colin?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's funny that last year's ResolveCon was, like one of the first of the more like in-person oriented things that I've started doing, kind of post-pandemic and actually getting to be with people in person. And it's by far my favorite one that I've done. Like the energy with the everyone who was there in person and you guys will all think that I'm full of it, but maybe Casey will believe me when I say that even just over Zoom and over a lot feel the energy of people out there now, even though we're not in the same space. But
Hmm.
at ResolveCon, going out to people out in many points over the world and having people in person there in the room, it was just a really overwhelming, cool experience to like be engaged with to that depth with all these people who were like all really really passionate about improving their craft and getting better. Regardless of what their angle is, wherever they're coming from, whether you're an editor or you're working in production or you want to get better at color grading or you want to do
Hmm.
visual effects, wherever you might be coming from, like everybody I spoke to that weekend, everybody that was there was so clearly like lit up and really passionate about using Resolve to like achieve their creative ends in a better way. And then obviously, Casey, you and me got to hang out. We got to hang out with Darren Moston. We got to hang out with Mr. Alex Tech and like,
Yeah.
so many of the other gang that, like we became like any of those guys who I didn't know over that weekend, like we became fast friends and it was just an amazing experience.
Yeah, man. I totally agree. So, if any of you are on the fence about coming in person, you got to, man. You got
Have
to
to.
make it out. You got to make it out. It's so much fun. We are going to be streaming some of it online. I would say most of it, but there's a lot that's going on that is not online. We're going to have breakouts. We're going to have a contest that is going to be really cool competition. Plus, hanging out, having coffee. We're going to go get ice cream together. It's going to be the best, man. It's literally going to be the best. So make sure that you at least consider going and getting your tickets at resolvecon.com. Okay. But for now, we're gonna get a little bit of wisdom here from one of the wisest color people I know. So, Cullen, we expect to be completely blown away. All right,
We
and
expect majesty.
I'm just
Exhilaration.
yeah.
All right. Let me see what I can do. Let me
All
press
right.
the order in some majesty for us real quick. So it's actually funny, the conversation that we started with talking about, like, why have you gone down all these strange corridors of like really complex color science and stuff? Because we wrapped up that conversation in a great way, which is to say that the end result, like the end benefit, of a lot of those things is arriving at simple, repeatable things that are
Mhm.
ideal for our creative intent. So that's actually, I'm going to share with you guys three very, very simple ideas that are the results of lots and lots of diving and exploration that I've made over the
Oh,
years
dang.
in
Yeah.
color grading. But it's just like really simple stuff. That's, I talk about it in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. It's one of the 10 Commandments. Simplicity beats complexity. So even though I love like geekery and getting complex, we need to seek to keep things as simple as possible because the complexity just happens. We have to fight
Yeah.
against that. Here's another fun phrase to go along with what was our other one? Granular authority. Uh,
Granular authority.
granular authority.
You have to say
Uh,
it like that.
yeah, it's required. It doesn't count if you didn't say it like that. The other one that I talk about a lot is something called complexity inertia, meaning that
Complexity inertia.
yeah, that one rings a little better, I think. But in color grading, it's like we're always being pulled toward more complex things. Has
Hmm.
anybody like we're going to talk about color. I'm going to share my screen in just a second here, but have any of you guys had the experience of like you start grading something up in Resolve and maybe you're getting somewhere decent and then you walk away and go grab a coffee and you look at your node graph and you're like, what
What have
in
I
the
done?
world is this? It looks like you've stepped in the mind of a sick person, you know?
Uh,
That's complexity inertia at work.
yeah.
Like the if we don't fight against it, things just keep getting more complicated and stacking up. So we
Yeah.
want to find simple, repeatable things that
Oh,
get us where we want to go.
yes. Let's do that.
All
That's
right.
awesome.
So let's see. I know how to use computers.
This is my first day computering.
This is my first day with computers. Everyone, bear with me. Okay, so I just got a timeline of some pictures, and we're going to talk about like some dirt level color grading, or dirt simple color grading principles, I should say. If you can
Ooh.
keep these in mind, like you're instantly going to do better work when you're color grading.
Okay.
So, number one, this is more backdrop. This is something we actually talked about a lot at ResolveCon last year. I'm sure it'll come up again this year, but more of a backdrop to my points for today. Make sure you're color managing. If you're not up on color management or you want to learn more about it, there's lots of stuff on my channel. But color managing is basically using color science to simply and consistently take what the camera saw and turn it into what a display can show. It's a no-brainer. If you're flying without it, then you're making a huge compromise right at the beginning of your project. It's taking too long. It's not looking as good. I could go on, but that's the foundation here. Is I've got some color management. I've also got a look in place over here at the timeline level. This is a look is a set of creative adjustments that don't change. So this is a LUT from my Voyager Pro LUT pack. Actually, it's from the Essentials pack, but it's from my Voyager set. It's just doing the same thing on all these images. So even though I'm going to grade underneath this look, the look itself is not going to change. So that's just backdrop. That's just context.
Do you want to
So,
close your gallery so we can see
oh
little better?
yeah, let's make it a little juicier. Thank you.
Juicier.
Yeah. And I'm going to shrink this down a little bit as well. So, number one thing that I want to talk about, I got three to share with you guys. Here's like, if you don't take away anything else from the couple of pointers I'm going to give you right now, this first one is probably the best one to walk away with. When we're thinking about color grading, and what's my job title? I am a colorist. There's so much thought that goes into color grading. Here's the dirtiest secret about color grading that I didn't figure out for an embarrassingly long time when I was figuring out my craft. The most important thing in color grading is not color. The most important thing in color grading is contrast and exposure. It's the luminance side of the equation. Why do I say that? Why is that? Well, to understand how I've arrived at that very simple sort of blanket statement that I just made, we can actually look at color science for a second, or specifically at human biology. Our eyes have two types of photoreceptors in them. One is responsible for perceiving color. One is responsible for perceiving changes in light, so contrast and exposure. We have way more of that one than we do the
Oh.
photosensitive, the photoreceptors for color. So that means that we will more easily tolerate, for example, a imbalance. If I'm going from this shot to that shot, if this shot is whatever, like a little greener than
Mm-hmm.
this shot, I can skate by on that. It'd be
Yeah,
better if it wasn't that way, but I can get away with it if my contrast and my exposure feel really good between the two
sure.
shots. So whether you're talking about matching, whether you're talking about in a vacuum, making one shot look its absolute best, it's one of the biggest temptations in color grading to look at a shot, land on a shot. It's almost instinctive. You like, even this one's a great example. I look at it, and even after all these years, I'm like, oh, you know what I need to do is I need to go into my balance node, pull that off a little bit, and really get the colors feeling right. That's actually not the best thing to do. The best thing to do, especially the louder that sort of itch is, the like itchier that itch is, the more important it is to work your exposure. I'm using a template node tree here that I recommend, but you can kind of do this however you want. I'm just doing my offset in a dedicated node called exposure. That's just literally optimizing exposure for what I want to see. Or if I was with a client, I would of course be incorporating their creative direction. And then ratio is just contrast ratio, which for me, I'm doing with my contrast and my pivot. This is what's most important. By the time I have filled out these two nodes, this is like 70-80% of all the good that I'm going to do for this shot. It either has happened or it hasn't happened right here. But
Mm.
it's these contribute 70 to 80% of how this shot is ultimately going to look, feel, and taste. So exposure and contrast take priority over color. Once you get those things in place, of course, color balance, you can see that's the very next thing in my node. It's super important. There's no reason to skip over it. But when you're trying to match shots, when you're trying to make shots look their best, it's very easy to prioritize color or even treat color and contrast on equal footing. And the truth is they're not. Exposure and contrast are more important than color. And even an exercise that I will do sometimes in a first pass, I'll go to the end of my node tree, pull all of my saturation out, and just go in and set my exposure and my contrast looking at the grayscale of the
Mm.
of the image. So that's number one. Contrast beats color. If you can get both, great. But if you can only get one, contrast and exposure are more important every time than getting a good color balance.
Man, yeah, that is a great example of, these informed decisions, right? Of something that making it less complicated. And I think I love that idea. And this is universal for any kind of, media creative kind of stuff. It's like doing the big jobs first, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, biggest job would be the color management, right? I mean, we got to
Yep.
get it in a realistic place, and then probably your look and making sure that like that the whole macro stuff is working, and then it's fixing the exposure and the contrast because that's like the next biggest thing, and then it goes down and down and down, and as you have more time, you have more leisure to go through things and change all the little details. That's when you can get crazy, but you don't want to spend an hour fixing something that nobody's going to notice.
Yeah.
If you haven't fixed the huge things that people are going to notice.
See, that's why we're friends. You get it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, man. I mean, this is another chapter in my book. The way I phrase it is greatest gains for least effort.
Hmm.
So, in other words, like for me working professionally, I'm always being like tyrannized by a clock. There's always a clock running against me, and I want to know at whatever point the bell gets rung and they say, hey, we got to go, we got to ship it, we're out of money to pay you, we're out of time, we have to deliver. It's wherever you're at right now, that's what's going out the door right now. That happens often in my business. I want to know when that bell gets rung that every minute I have spent was the best possible use I could have made of that time.
Yeah.
And the exact flow that you just gave is the way you do that. You start with the big things and you look for the easiest gains that you can make in the shortest period of time. And then you go to the next easiest gain in the shortest period of time and you flow forward from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, like I was saying, that is a concept that works for editing, that works for audio mixing, that works for
Yep.
compositing. That's like that's everything. That works for 3D modeling. Like, I mean, everything that's like sort of a creative involved thing, man. I mean,
Yep.
works for woodworking, man. That's like
Totally.
it's such a good concept, and I love that you apply that to color because that's just a smart way to work.
Hey, you know what? Here's the wild connection. It works for doing the dishes. Now, My wife,
Yes, that's how
my
I
wife.
do the dishes.
Do you pre-organize?
I have everything on one side and
Hmm.
I rinse everything off and get all the nasties off first. And
Yes.
like, throw away the food and everything. So it's like worst case, it's the exact same thing. It's like if I got to ship this, if
This man gets it.
I got to ship
This
these
man
dishes.
gets it. My wife makes fun of me. She's like, "Why don't you just put the stuff in the dishwasher?" I'm like, "Because there's a system, honey.
Yeah.
There's a best way to do it."
Don't bother me. I'm being
I'm in
crazy.
my happy place. By the way, that's one of the happiest 10 minutes of my day, standing there doing the dishes, just enough conscious activities that I can, like meditate a little bit or think pleasant thoughts. I love doing the dishes.
That's awesome, man. That's great.
Yeah. So and really what's funny is, this point that we're emphasizing now about like doing the next most important thing. That's kind of the theme that we're going to see with the next two things that we're going to talk about as well. So the next one that I wanted to emphasize to you guys is another just big rule of thumb, and that's that shadows are more important than highlights.
Mm.
Now, does anybody like when I say things like that, even when I say the last thing, contrast over color, shadows beat highlights. Even though I'm convicted about these things and I'm going to try to prove to you why I'm right in just a moment, when I feel those words coming out of my mouth, I cringe a little bit. So I'm like, what a dumb generalization. Like how in the world do you feel like you have the authority to say that?
So you're
But
the
the
master of
reality is,
all images. Really cool.
yeah. No, you don't want to know why it is. It's because we've done. I did that side quest at one point,
Sure.
and reached the understanding. Again, this goes back to human biology. We are far more sensitive to changes and adjustments in the low end of an image than in the high end.
Mm.
Like if anyone needs proof of that, have you ever like been asked to audition the difference between like, oh, this display only hits 700 nits and it's supposed to hit 1,000. This is like a
Yeah.
big thing in my business. You ever had someone tell you that and you look at it and you're like, okay,
Oh, looks pretty
I
good.
cannot see the difference of 300 nits at all.
Yeah.
It's because like things don't scale linearly up there. Like that difference of 300 nits, it's we're just not as sensitive up there. Now, if I were to raise the floor of my image
Instantly notice.
3%,
Yeah.
you will notice it. Like if we can even, let's go over here to this shot, for example. If I go to my something like my lift, and this is a rough approximation, but if I pick this up 3%, like
Oh
that's a
yeah.
massive difference.
Yeah.
And that's not a perfectly scientific comparison I'm making, but the point is that we are absolutely more sensitive to subtle changes in shadows than we are to changes in highlights. And really, if you think about images for a minute, something that I've also just come to like believe from having graded, many, many, many tens of thousands of images, is that images live from middle exposure down. Like that's where the life of the image is.
Mm.
Everything up above, that's like seasoning. Like if you
Okay.
don't put any salt or any seasoning on your dish, it's not going to taste awesome. It's
Hmm.
important, but what the meat of the dish, like the substance of the dish, is middle exposure and below. So
Oh
that's
yeah.
like another area where I feel like we can get. There's so many tools for manipulating high end contrast. There's so much discussion about off and HDR and like getting like brighter, sharper highlights, or am I protecting my highlights, or am I in, like all these kind of conversations that come
Yeah.
up, all totally valid and worthy of exploration. But
Hmm.
like in this shot, for example, like let's see how we evolve here. I think my hard drive might have gone to sleep, so I'll wait for it to spin up so I can see. I'm hoping that this character steps a little bit more into frame. We'll find out here momentarily. Resolve's going to hold me in suspense. But even while I wait for that, let's assume for a moment that we're looking at a shot that evolves where this character moves into frame. Perfect, he does. So, like look at this moment right here. This matters more than that. If I
Mm.
can get more life here, that's going to be time better spent than trying to roll in that highlight out the window.
Yeah.
Even though I can do both, and if I wanted to do both, and if time and budget permitted, those would both be very worthy pursuits. If I can, or if I'm trying to figure out where to start, I'm going to start with shadow stuff every time because it pays out more. The human eye is going to notice it more. If I get it wrong, I'm going to pay more. If I get it right, it's going to feel better than if I make an equivalent sort of finesse in the high end.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you can't see any detail in his jacket and everything, and it just looks weird, but you're like, dude, those windows though.
Yeah, yeah,
Everyone's gonna be like,
totally.
nobody cares, man. Like nobody cares about the windows.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so like I just kind of like dropped a control point here on my custom curves, and I'm now holding Option to sort of like move up the ladder a little bit because I tapped his jacket. So now theoretically what that means is that I've got this segment down here that pretty well like lassos this tonal region without too much, without including too much other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I can now go in and just start to fill that in a little bit without necessarily changing the overall feeling of contrast in the image. And I'm
Yeah.
just kind of doing this by feel, but like check that out.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily feel lower in contrast, and that's very different than, you know, another of my kind of like frustrations sometimes with color grading is when things get bucketed into like, oh, is it low con or high con? Well, like high con would be that and low con would be that, but what would what I just did be? You
Sure.
know, it's lower contrast, but it's so localized that it's really not changing the feeling of snap in the image. It's just making sure that we're taking absolute best advantage of, you know, like again, to get kind of geeky for a second with color science, we're basically making sure that we're taking advantage of every code value in the 10-bit signal down here on this lower end. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
want to like my goal with the low end in particular is like I want to hang on and hold off from hitting black. Eventually, I want to get there, but I want to hold off from hitting black for as long as possible. It's almost like landing an airplane. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather be on this airplane in terms of landing. I was on an airplane last night than being on this airplane. See what I
Yeah.
mean? That's a
Yep.
more gradual landing. It feels better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes sense. That's interesting. Now, okay, so here's a nerdy question. So does it, and maybe I'm a little mistaken here too, but the reason why you're protecting those and trying to get all those code values from the lower end and stuff is, what does that have to do with there being like less samples and stuff down in the lower part, like in a log signal?
Yeah, I mean that's a great thing to talk about as well. So like basically there, I mean it really you could look at it through the lens of like the way a log distributes code values. It's going to roughly do it evenly. So it's level in that sense. But again, if we go back to human biology, even with like, you know, the distance from here to here in log is the same as the distance from there to there, but not to my eye. Like to
Mm,
my eye, changes down here are a lot, I'm a lot more sensitive than to changes up here. So it's actually like, it depends on where you are. Like if you're working in linear, like you often will, if you're compositing, Casey, that's a whole different story. That's a scenario where like changes in the low end are going to be way, way, way touchier than changes in the high end, not just because of our eyes, but because of that linear domain. In
mm,
the case of log, it's pretty evenly distributed, but even then, changes in the bottom just feel we're going to respond more sensitively to them than changes in the top.
sure. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Wow. This is so much fun, man. I could get into this for a long time, but anyways.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like again, I think like these two, and then the third I want to wrap us up with in terms of like hands-on tips. These are all things that I'm hoping, like, you know, for any of you guys who are in the color page at all, like whether you're like a colorist, whether you own stuff, whether you just want to have a little bit more literacy in the color page, these are things that you can take into any project and get
Mm,
better outcomes than by ignoring or overlooking these principles. So that's the idea here. Is they're very simple, top level things that require like, you know, taste and context, but they're going to hold you know, like pretty well across the board.
yeah.
So the last one that I want to talk about, we've kind of talked about these like dueling concepts or these dueling priorities and which is more important than the other. The last one that I thought I'd share with you guys is separation is more important than saturation. That's one that I've talked about in different forms over the years, but I've become really passionate about. Here's like another lesson that I've learned less from, I would say, contemporary color science than from exploring the history of our craft. And like for those who don't know, something sort of like disorienting for a person who does what I do professionally is that my job didn't exist like 30 years ago. It's like a
Mm.
very, very new job that someone made up really
Yeah.
recently. Before that, the closest thing we had, our counterparts were color timers who were literally and determining as we strike a print from this film negative, how much red, green, and or blue light are we going to push through that negative? And by altering that ratio, they could change the balance and the relative like intensity, brightness or darkness of the image that the print would ultimately receive, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah.
So that's a very rudimentary system. And what those color timers had at their disposal, if we wanted to kind of recreate that, this this offset ball right here, that is all they had. How much red, how much green, how much blue, or you can move them all up or down uniformly. That was all they had. And you listen to that and you're like, oh, that's kind of neat, that's kind of an interesting factoid, but that's something that has fascinated me for my entire career, because the
Hmm.
more I think about it, I'm like, wait, but what about this? What, they didn't have any power windows? How did they
Yeah.
deal with that? Well, they had to light with much more precision on set. The
Yeah.
other one that comes to me all the time that connects up to our conversation about saturation versus separation, color timers did not have a saturation knob.
Mm.
Saturation is a video thing. So like if I look at this image and I think it's too saturated and I'm timing it for a print, what do I do?
Mm.
I have no knob for that, right? So here's where the principle of separation comes in over saturation. What I can think about if I want to, well, I'll actually give you two principles here. In the case of wanting to get less saturation, which like you could definitely look at this image and be like, it's a little too saturated. What you could do in lieu of using a saturation knob, oftentimes if you feel like something's too saturated, usually it can be remedied by cooling it off.
Hmm.
So if I cool that off a little bit, we're going from here to there. I'm torturing your eyes on YouTube. Sorry, it's a fairly small adjustment.
Like, oh,
Before,
yes, it's the same.
after. And it is the same. You have passed my BS test. No, it's like I'll exaggerate it a little bit more for the sake of example. Before, after. Now, this is something I would never do, but just for sake of example, if you are my client and you look at this image and you go, you know what, it's kind of saturated. Her skin's feeling a little, like overly spray tanned. Can you desaturate a little bit? And I go to you, okay, no problem. How's this?
Hmm.
Wouldn't you feel like I was moving in the right direction?
Sure.
So even though I'm not reaching for a saturation knob, there's still in fact, this is I would argue, a better place to start. If I can get it done by moving my balance around,
Hmm.
that's a simpler adjustment than a saturation adjustment. So that goes back to the simplicity versus complexity thing.
Yeah. I mean,
So
because
that,
it makes sense because I mean, if you look at it like on a vector scope or something, you're essentially desaturating that color when you're moving it away from that color, right?
right,
I mean,
exactly,
but it's just
exactly,
more selective
right. That's
and it's
exactly it.
transferring the saturation to a different color, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You can see it. This is what Casey's talking about. We're going from being quite warm dominant to still warm, leading warm, but we've got a little more blue counterweight down there.
Hmm.
And I think the other reason that works is like, what's the color? You guys are maybe familiar with the idea of memory colors.
Hmm.
Memory colors are colors that we already know what the heck they should look like. You don't have to tell us. Those
Yeah.
three colors, the biggest ones, are skin, skies, and foliage. If you show me weird skin, I might not even know that what I'm looking at is weird, but I know.
Yeah.
Like that skin looks weird. My mom would tell you that skin looks weird.
Yeah.
Any layperson would tell you that skin looks weird with no knowledge of color grading. So those memory colors are really important to hit. And as a result, when we think something, basically anytime we have a beef with an image, it's usually because the memory colors don't feel right to us.
Hmm.
So if I think an image is oversaturated, it is probably because I think the skin is oversaturated. That's to me the other main reason why that works, because that is going to
Sure.
cool off skin.
Yeah.
So that's actually just one sort of aspect of this sat versus separation angle. I mean, you could kind of put a broader umbrella on this and say that it's about like, okay, if we didn't have a saturation knob, how could we achieve the goals that we often have when we reach for the saturation knob? This is one example here. Well, if we wanted to desaturate, we could simply cool things off. Another example would be if we look at like this shot here. Let's just grade this shot up. I'll give you guys another just like sort of tick that I have in color grading. I want to see eyes. I want to see both eyes. So I typically will scrub to that frame in the image. But I'm just going to go through here and I'm going to expose up a little bit. I'm going to go to my ratio node and work my contrast pivot. I'm really going to pop that. Try to get that feeling really good. And now let's once again say, well, we want to make this feel colorful. We want to make it feel, we want to optimize color, but we don't have a saturation knob. What can we do? Well, the way that I do that, the first line of defense for me is this balance node, and I'm using my offset in my balance node, and I'm looking at two things. I'm looking at skin tone, and I'm looking at color separation. I'm trying to get optimized skin tone, and I'm trying to get maximum color separation in my image. It's another like related factoid to what we're talking about right now. If you guys want to know the number one secret of what makes the film look, quote unquote, so desirable, why we're so after it, why we respond so favorably to it, it's because it feels very colorful without ever getting garish. And the reason for that is because there's high color separation in a well shot piece of film. There's actually not incredibly high color saturation in an absolute sense. It rolls over fairly fast. But up until that point, the colors are very well separated, which makes it feel very colorful. So it's really that combo, that cocktail of like strong separation with limited saturation that gives film its character and prevents it from getting garish or weird. That's one of the main things, in my opinion, that we respond to when we say, I want that feeling for my image.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But like in the case of this, if you look at this is me kind of trying to embody that goal. Make her skin look great, max out that separation. I'm looking at both the image and at my vector scope. You know, if you look at here's where we started, here's where we are now. Basically, if you imagine two X's running through this, so
We
take
can't
this
see the
skin.
vector scope on the screen recording
Oh
actually.
no, you got to see my scope. Oh, I think it's because I'm only sharing Resolve.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask you guys to imagine a vector scope in your mind's eye. A vector scope, if you don't already know it, it's one of the default scopes in Resolve. It's a big circle. It's a color wheel that shows you your red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow, and it gives you a view of where your colors are strongest and weakest in your image, for those who don't know. And a great rule of thumb to support the agenda that we're going after right now is if you look at the signal mass of your vector scope on any given image, if you can get your image better straddling all four quadrants of the vector scope is divided into four quadrants like a pizza. If you can get more quadrants activated by moving your balance around, in the case of this shot, I'm activating more of the upper right quadrant, the magenta quadrant, before in the warm, like the upper left and the lower left, and not as strongly in the two right quadrants. I'm now sort of like straddling those four quadrants a little bit better. That's a really good predictor for getting better separation. So you can do it by eye, and the vector scope can support you as well. But basically what I'm doing here is I haven't increased my saturation at all. And this is a fairly subtle example, I would say. But if we look at the before and after, the after, here's your before, there's your after. The after feels more colorful because there is more contrast between, for example, this young girl's hoodie and her skin. So it's a great way to think about, you know, when you are getting the note to go for saturation or when you're thinking about saturation, if you can just kind of get into the impulse of like, well, have I optimized my color balance? Have I maxed out my color separation? What you're going to find when you've done that is that you'll need that saturation adjustment far less. That's how those color timers got away with skipping saturation because they didn't have it. And that when you do reach for that saturation knob, you're going to get better results because you've really optimized the ratio of red to green to blue underneath that step.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. It's distributing the colors before you make them stronger.
Yeah, exactly. And the cool thing actually that you could do in reverse, sometimes if you're not sure how to balance something, if you want to get a great sense for where your balance is resting, I'm disabling that balance node for a second, crank up that sat and it's going to tell you really fast.
Mm-hmm.
Now when I go back to the balance node, it's actually more obvious to me where I need to take this because the colors that are a little bit too strong are now far too strong.
Sure.
Whatever imbalance in the ratio from red to green to blue there is becomes more pronounced. So that's actually a great way. Sometimes you want to do this first before you're really locking in your sat. But sometimes if you want to get a clearer sense of where your balance is resting and where you want to take it, you
Mm-hmm.
can do a downstream sat node and just juice it and use that as kind of your basis for getting better
Man.
separation.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That's
So
wonderful.
that's a couple tricks for you. You think you can use
Man.
those, buddy?
Yeah, those are awesome. Those are awesome. Yeah, Colin, thank you, man. This has been really neat.
Yeah,
Really
of course,
appreciate
man.
that. It's always nice to hear these kind of things, these concepts and everything. And I love that you kind of um, bake them down into, this is more important than this, or it can be prioritized.
Yeah.
That just that helps simplify things, which is, couldn't we all use a little more simplicity in trying all of our crazy projects?
Absolutely couldn't. I mean, it's a crazy thing to go into things with no playbook and no sense of priority or like how
Mm,
to tackle things. That's chaos. That's not good art. If our intuition when we're first learning art is like, oh, art is this like free flowing like completely boundless, ruleless place. But anyone who's done any amount of art professionally or otherwise will, I'm sure, agree that like that's a great recipe for going insane. Like you have to have some parameters on what you're doing.
yes. Yeah. Yeah, man. One of my favorite things to do is show people like the fixed node tree workflow, like that haven't ever used that. And they're just like, dang, is it really that simple? It's like, yeah, man, just you
Hmm.
make yourself a to-do list and you can just work through it. Then you have a structure. They're just like, wow, I can actually color grade stuff. I'm like, yeah, man.
Absolutely. I mean, it's
So
so
good.
funny. I was literally just talking maybe 2 days ago with one of my favorite colorists who I just admire so much and I consider a friend, but I just really, really love their work. I think it's so beautiful. And we were talking about the pressures of working with limited budget, limited time, limited resources to get a job across the finish line. And I was complimenting this person on some recent work they'd done on like a major TV series. I was like, it is just like, how did you pull it off? What did you do? And they gave me the inside scoop where they're saying like, you know what, we had like a day for each of those episodes. So what I did is I set a look and I worked my fundamentals underneath it, and a lot of the time for a lot of shots that's all I was able to do. There was
Yeah.
no time for windows, there was no time for third and fourth looks, there was no time
Yeah.
for finesse. It was just like the kind of stuff we're talking about here today.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's where
Crazy.
the pros make the money,
And
you
it's
know.
probably shot amazingly,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
not,
shot well for sure. Shot underneath a viewing LUT that reflected the ultimate creative intent, all of
yeah.
which helps support that. But it's like that's so often like where that's where you have to make the image work because so often that's the only crack you get at it. Sometimes the clock just runs out by the time you're done with that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, man. Exactly. Well, that's really cool. Hey, Cullen, we're going to let you go, man, but thank you so much for hanging with us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. And I'm really excited to hang out with you in just a little over a month for ResolveCon. Guys, if you haven't checked out ResolveCon, check out resolvecon.com and get your in person tickets because that's where the magic is. But we will be streaming the main sessions here on the channel live. But yeah, make sure to go and check it out and consider it, okay? Because I want to hang out with you. And I'm going to speak for Colin, and I think he does too.
I do. I know I'm going to get a fist bump from you when I see you, but I would love to get a fist bump from all you guys. I love getting to do this stuff in person and connect one or just in interpersonal settings with these things because it's fun to work online, but it's really cool to get to hang out in person.
Yeah, it is for sure.
Yeah.
Colin, if somebody wants to check out your stuff, where can they go?
Oh, you could go over to my YouTube if you want more of the type of content and instruction that we talked about today. If you want to see some of my portfolio work or client-facing work, CullenKellyColor.com. But those would be two good stops.
All right, man. Well, hey,
All right, brother.
thank you. I appreciate it. And
Thanks, dude.
thank you to everybody who's been here on the stream, and we'll see you guys later.
See you at ResolveCon.